One of the touchiest subjects in a looter shooter is, with little surprise, getting loot. Or I should say, how you get said loot, and how fast you can actually find what you want. By most standards, according to many comments and threads, posts, articles, tweets, etc. that I have seen over the years, you would think that Outriders would be one of the greatest loot games of all time. It has a huge amount of endgame loot. It shows you the chance of getting loot before the endgame missions. It allows you to transfer the best talents onto other gear pieces. It even allows you to upgrade almost any item all the way to the end game. It also does tend to provide loot in abundance, especially in the later game. It also has a open loot system allowing any item to potentially drop from anywhere. So why is it that players are upset with the loot in Outriders? Why is it that Outriders loot was almost as equally hated, if not even more so, as the game-breaking bugs, the constant disconnects, and the horrendous matchmaking at launch? Now, before I talk about the loot issues more, I do want to stress that none of the issues in Outriders should be acceptable by any company making video games. They are all pretty much unacceptable from a product that was actually paid for by the consumer. Many of them resulted in the game being abandoned by the vast majority of the player base. Rushed releases and forced production timelines ruined this game in what could have otherwise been a great entry into the genre by People Can Fly. Not being able to actually log in, not being able to actually join other players' games, the bizarre facial mapping issues that had to have been seen by anyone testing the game, the inventory wipe issues, not to mention the constant freezing and other forced closure issues in the game. These problems, especially after the spectacular launch disaster of a much more hyped game a few months before, have really hurt the perception of the gaming industry. And that is already after years and years of slimy practices because of the push towards digital content, DLC, and the over-reliance on patching after launch to make games finally work. Of course, that last jab was actually at Cyberpunk 2077, which saw many of the same launch problems that Outriders did. However, from my perspective, Outriders was in a much worse state at launch. Now, I played Cyberpunk on the One X with an external SSD. So I did see a lot fewer issues than anyone on a base last-gen console. But that indicates the source of the issues. Cyberpunk ignored much of the work that was needed for older hardware. A huge mistake for sure. Outriders, on the other hand, was just a coding mess across the board with an always connected infrastructure that needed huge amounts of work, and it didn't really matter how you played the game, it was just a hot mess at launch, period. Now, the reason for this video: the loot failure of Outriders. From my time being active almost daily in the Division forums to when I was making a lot of Division 2 content, there was always a fundamental difference of opinion that I had with many others. The main source of this being the how, what, and why of getting loot. For many of the casual community, and maybe some of the more experienced, gamers, the open loot system is viewed as this wonderful solution to all of gaming's problems. And if you're not familiar with the term, it is basically a system that allows all loot in a game to be found regardless of what content you play. For example, just kind of farming the weakest enemies or the easiest bosses should eventually give you all the loot in the game. And many claim it is the cure-all to most developer design choices. Don't have friends to farm with? Open loot is better. Don't have time to farm? Open loot wins. Are rather terrible at games? Open loot somehow makes you better. Want to only play the fastest mission 100 times a day? Open loot. A game's stats are poorly designed? Somehow again, open loot fixes that too. Terrible at PvP? Open loot makes you better at that too. I could go on, but at this point I hope you get the absurdity of some of these claims. Open loot does do one thing quite well. It ensures that the game dies pretty quickly. Now, if you ask a person who's obsessed with the open loot pool to name a game that does it well, most of them end up using Borderlands as their prime and usually only example. Now, if you ignore the fact that the series had increased sales after they added the specific item farming locations and boss farming locations, it could be an okay argument. But let's be honest with the biggest issue people had with the original Borderlands, and that was loot. Usually it involved farming the same set of chests for hours over and over again, or just visiting the vendors until you were bored out of your mind. Adding specific locations or bosses to farm gear made farming feel more dynamic, and it improved the gameplay diversity. Not to mention it made it easier to find the specific items that you were actually looking for and wanted. Now, I'm sure many will have heard the argument that I paid for it, so I should get loot however I want. And by that standard, why even play the game? It is clearly not about loot, and mostly about instant gratification. Players pretty much just want to say that they paid for it, so they should get a participation trophy. And to be honest, most games aren't fun like that. But if you look at a not so shiny example of the open loot system, like in Anthem, which again was heavily criticized for its awful loot system, people generally don't have fun doing chest runs for hours on end to gear up. They also don't generally enjoy running the same boss countless times just for the simple reason it is the fastest way of grinding all the loot in the game. Not to mention, no way of targeting the specific loot types you really want. Not many people want to play loot pool soup, but in the open loot pool system, this is for the most part what you will end up getting. Open loot almost always results in players getting so many redundant copies of items they already didn't want that if they ever do get something they're actually looking for, they usually have no desire to keep going at that point, or potentially becoming so uninterested that they quit the game well before they get many of the actual true endgame items. Now, Destiny, despite many of its annoying shortcomings, actually did a wonderful job with loot in my opinion. They had a decent-sized generalized loot pool to make a playthrough interesting at various stages of gameplay. However, they also added many secrets and unique ways to be rewarded with exciting must-have items. Sure, a few of the items might have been priced above some player's skill level or the amount of time they were willing to invest, but it also gave players a reason to try harder content and keep more of the community united and active as they searched for specific pieces of gear, which again kept people doing activities, ensuring most things stayed populated and did not just die, giving newer players a chance to actually enjoy playing the game with others and not generally locking them out of the content because, again, it was dead content. It even encouraged a large portion of the community to carry others through their first completions on much of the difficult content. To this day, getting my Black Spindle was one of the most exciting memories in gaming that I have. It took a good bit of effort. It took a good bit of planning and a lot of rage, but in the end, it actually felt rewarding. Like I have said many times before, memorable moments are the best part of a game. If you don't vividly remember the time you got said item, odds are it was not exciting or fun. Had this just been a random occurrence, I randomly got RNG on my side and got the Black Spindle from any random activity, I know it would have just been another piece of gear I got with little to no enjoyment. I would have had no memory of it. It would have just been something, again, that I got. Now, how does this relate to the problems that we see in Outriders? Well, go back to why I said it could have been one of the greatest loot games of all time. It has a huge amount of endgame loot to acquire, which many games just kind of fail to include. In fact, most games just slowly trickle new gear over the course of different content additions, and maybe after 2 or 3 years finally reach what Outriders included from the start. But what I also jokingly said is that it has an open loot pool allowing any item to potentially drop from anywhere. Now consider that for a moment. A huge amount of endgame loot to find, but without a clear path to get most of it. Sure, a few select weapons can be had from doing some of the questline stuff, and you can use multiple runs to acquire pretty much all of those, relatively easily before endgame. But that still leaves about 100 plus items totally up to RNG. So not only are you at the mercy of luck, but it is a very real possibility that you might never see the items you want before you are just sick of the game. Sure, farming a targeted loot location for that 5% drop chance of the item you really want can be a bit annoying. But now multiply that by 100 on the same missions. Yeah, it was not really amazing to farm Lexington in the Division for Barrett's chest over and over, but could you imagine, after farming that same mission hundreds of times, you still needed to farm it again for 99 more items, meaning that you could potentially need to farm this mission thousands of times to get all of the items. The simple truth of open loot is that it ruins the enjoyment of games far more than a low chance to get an item at a given location. Farming for hundreds of hours on the shortest possible missions only to get countless repeats is one of the most discouraging endeavors in gaming. This is why Outriders has had such a problem with endgame loot. Players don't want a vague and random amalgamation of loot. Generally, when you are making a build or want to try something different, you have a clear idea in mind and you want to get a specific item. Outriders loot has almost no clear progression path. The result is similar to that of biting your cheek while eating food. You're almost certain to do it again and be even more pissed off when it happens. My first 10 legendary items amounted to 3 of the same AR, 3 of the same pistol, and 2 of the same shotgun with only 2 other unique items. So even with a pool of 100 plus items, 50% right out the gate were redundant. Once I got a larger amount of diverse items, it was even more cringe to loot the endgame challenge tiers. I would need to run dozens of expeditions in the hopes of getting something unique for my build. The week before I finally had enough, I was lucky to find 2 items I needed. The lack of specific farming locations combined with an RNG that actually gets worse as you go and an endgame that revolves around doing the same handful of missions for all of the possible items is truly a nightmare of game design. Now, the devs at People Can Fly are supposedly increasing the drop rates for legendary gear, which, in all honesty, is just a band-aid on the problem. Yes, it will result in more overall chance to get what you need or want, but it will also result in more redundant loot, which will give rise to a new set of anger from the players who are still managing to hold some hope in the game. Just like the RNG in the Division 2 cosmetic boxes, once you manage to get down to those last few items, it became almost futile to try. Opening more just leads to endless duplicates. Had they just simply given a specific location and a narrow selection of loot and tied some of the items to their namesake bosses, like for example the Pyromancer's Akari armor, being a specific drop from the Molten Akari Lava Spider, then included maybe a remodeled version of that boss fight as part of an expedition, well, loot issues would not have been so burdensome for the average player. Now, there is no singular way to make good loot systems. From experience, I can say gamers generally do better with a variety of mechanics. For example, having a small generic loot pool of open world items, having a quest or mission specific reward, having items that depend on player skill and some 100% luck based, having items that can only be found solo or only earned in a group, having PvE only items, having PvP only items. They can also have a lot of success by creating community based events and puzzles, not to mention vendors with limited amount of rotating stock. The point is, the more creative and interesting approaches that a team uses around loot, the better it is for the overall community. Having such a boring and singular path to the endgame like in Outriders results in the expected outcome, which is a bored and uninterested player base. But anyway guys, that is it for this video. I hope you're having fun in whatever game you're currently playing, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.